Lord, yes, papi, hit me one time and make it funky.
I was brought up and told to have no bed. I was brought up and told to have no bed. I was brought up and told to have no bed.
Welcome to the Full Circle Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, David Roberts, along with the OG, Dr. Neal Holmes. Missing today is the oral historian, Andre Taylor. Dr. Holmes, we have the situation in the Ukraine, Russia invading the Ukraine. And I can remember vividly, taking one of your classes at the University of Akron. And you told us to always think about, any situation that goes on, any narrative you hear, think about how it affects our people throughout the diaspora. Now, although I know in my heart that our people are everywhere, probably when most people think about Ukraine, they don't think about Black folks. It's like, you like Ukraine, you think of snow and the Klitschko's. But it's interesting to hear what's going on with our people. Before we get into the history, in fact, why don't we do that first? Let's get into the history of this situation, because I'm in the dark. And, we were talking before, we started, where you know a little bit about the history of this conflict.
Yeah, well, the history goes back a few years, and in many ways we can go back to let's say around 1990, 1991, because Ukraine became really an independent state in 1991. It didn't exist as an independent state before that. It was part of the old Soviet Union. And during the time when there was negotiation between the United States and at that time, George Herbert Walker Bush, the elder Bush, was in negotiations with Gorbachev, who at that time was the premier of the Soviet Union and the leader of the Soviet Union, and part of the discussion was if the Soviet Union dismantles itself, what would the United States do? I mean, what would be and what George Bush said to Gorbachev, well, we won't take NATO beyond Germany. And that was the understanding. They didn't get it in writing. They didn't write a treaty, which was really Gorbachev's another error that he made. But his understanding was that if you dissolve the Soviet Union, NATO itself would go away. Back up just a few more years, NATO came into existence, I believe, in 1947 or so. And it consisted of 10 countries, mostly Western European countries. And the idea behind NATO was that NATO existed to block the expansion of the then Soviet Union, which Ukraine at that time was a part of. And so prior to the breakup of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union in response, about 6 or 7 years later, put together something called the Warsaw Pact to defend itself, against what it saw as NATO. So you had these two pacts, the Eastern Bloc, the Warsaw Pact, and NATO, the Western Bloc. So before the Soviet Union dissolved itself and went out of business, essentially, it basically also dissolved the Warsaw Pact. So it gave up really the idea of this collective defense, because it saw itself as going into a new relationship with the West. However, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact has gotten bigger than ever. It's more than doubled in size. And so what, from Putin's standpoint, and I don't condone the killing of, young people and innocents and that sort of thing, but from Putin's position, the NATO was intent not merely to see the dissolution of Soviet Union, they were intent upon the breaking up and of what was left of Russia and some of the other surrounding states that it might be friendly with, because it kept adding more NATO states closer and closer. Now we jump further into the 2000s, and in 2013, you had a pro-Russian guy who had been elected to presidency, and his name was Yunovich and Yukonovich, and he was pretty corrupt, and his corruption got people upset, and so people came out and demonstrated, protested, and so forth, and but what happened was that you also brought in a number of right-wing. When Putin said neo-Nazis are involved, he's really not lying. There are neo-Nazis involved in that area, white supremacists there as well. And they began doing some things like tearing down statues of those soldiers who had fought, Soviet soldiers who had fought against the Nazis, and erecting statues of people who had collaborated with Nazis. So he's not totally wrong. I mean, yeah, you also, you have white supremacist elements in Russia itself today as well. I mean, but you certainly have those in Ukraine who have come in, many of them had flocked to the banner of the Ukraine. I mean, I'm talking earlier, and as a result of that, you see some tensions, because Ukraine, when you have the removal of Yanukovych, I'm sorry, you have the removal of Yanukovych from office, and then you have replaced with a pro-Western. So basically, you have the country kind of was divided between like people who were pro-European Union, who wanted to kind of move toward the West in culture and so forth, and then you had the many in the East who want to move with the Russians. So you had this split. And as a result of kind of what some people refer to as a coup, some people in the East say, well, hey, we want to secede. We want to go with Russia. So you began really a war that's been going on since probably 2013, 2014. Also, the people of Crimea, and you have to remember that Crimea was part of Russia for years. And both the Russians and the Ukrainians are Slavic people, which means I say that to say this, the word that we use for slavery today comes from the fact that the Slavic people were the most enslaved people in the world until we got caught up in it. And Crimea was actually a slave port, so it has some resonance historically as well as some modern stuff there, and so the Russians did take over, retook Crimea, and you had the people on the east in the Donbass region who were basically maintaining their own sort of situation under arms, and you had this fighting going back and forth. Now part of the issue here is that there was an agreement called the Minsk Agreement, signed in Minsk in Belarus, and essentially that was supposed to end some of this fighting between the people in the east, those pro-Russians, and people in the west. And what it called for was, one of the key things that it called for was autonomy in the west, in the east, so these people could have kind of run their own affairs and elections. Now, the current government, Zelensky, has done several things that kind of got Putin's goat in some ways. One of the things that he did was to pretty much tapped the Minsk agreement and said, "Hey, we're not going to sign off on that. We know it's there, but we're not going to we're not going to endorse. We're not going to go ahead with it." Uh, uh, and also, what he did was there was a pro-Russian party, and before this uh, uh, current situation that we have occurred, the pro-Russian party was actually pro-Russian forces were polling higher than Zelensky. And because they look at him as corrupt, because all of those leaders have been corrupt. Last three leaders have been corrupt, whether they're pro-Russian or pro-Western, they've been corrupt. That's why the European Union has not allowed Ukraine to become a member, because one of the key reasons because there's been so much corruption. And Zelensky came in as an anti-corruption ticket, but he's more corrupt than the guy that he replaced. So you have all of this kind of stuff. And so this, along with the fact that to Putin's position is if in fact NATO troops are placed in Ukraine, then the Soviet Union would be almost totally surrounded by NATO troops, NATO forces. So this was the key element. And this is how we get to where we are, and no one in the West, none of the leadership was willing to really say. I mean, Macron to some degree said that Putin had something, there was some, he had some concerns that needed to be dealt with, with this NATO on its borders. But there was no real attempt at real diplomacy to get to the heart of the matter. And so then he moved in and invaded. So this is how we sort of get to where we are, because from Putin's point, he's seeing this as an existential threat, a threat to the very existence of Russia. And he also sees an attempt by the West to humiliate him and humiliate, by extension, Russia.
And I'm glad you set the groundwork for this, because I think a lot of people don't know what's going on, like, what is this all about? And then as we start looking as to how it affects our people, I was researching. Unlike you, who has all this knowledge, I have to do some research. So I had to look at racist incidents, and some are documented on video, and they have a hashtag trending right now on Twitter, Africans in Ukraine. And so more than 1.5 million who have fled Ukraine since Russia's invasion. There was a Nigerian gentleman, Alexander Somto Ora, and hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. He said he witnessed 3 separate incidents of racial discrimination against evacuees by Ukrainian authorities. At a train station in Kiev, police officers said they prioritized entry to women and children, but they denied access to a group of African women, some of whom were pregnant, even as African men pleaded with the authorities to let them pass. At another station, officers said only Ukrainian nationals could pass, but this Nigerian gentleman said he saw them take only white people. And the authorities didn't respond when he and others confronted them to ask how they knew who was Ukrainian without checking passports. And at the Ukraine-Poland border, white and non-white people were separated by a barricade. And authorities allowed the white group to move more quickly and in large numbers while mostly ignoring the people of color. So this doesn't surprise me, I think the only thing that surprised me was, again, I didn't know there was that large a number of Africans in the Ukraine, but of course, it said most of them are exchange students. So you mentioned before, other than that discrimination, how does this impact the African continent? How does this impact, impact our people?
And some of those are students from Africa, but some are Ukrainian citizens themselves, because during the Soviet days, you would have people who would come to Ukraine to study. Some would stay, they would marry, and so and have children. So you have some Black Ukrainians. Maybe not a huge number, but you have some. And the other thing we need to point out is that the kind of white nationalism that we see emerging in the United States is not merely emerging in the United States. We see it emerging in all over Europe, including Eastern Europe, including those NATO states that we see, including in Russia itself. There's another Nigerian gentleman who's I think a Polish citizen. He's a doctor. He's been in Poland for several years, at least a decade or so, maybe two. And he's been setting up places for them to sleep and so forth. But he has experienced quite a bit of racism himself. So this, so when we look at this, it's students and Nigeria by itself has 4,000 students in Ukraine, just Nigeria. And so we add these other numbers, it's a fairly sizable number. But there's some other ramifications of this thing. So for instance, in West Africa, in the area that we call the Sahel, that area between, the Sahara Desert, as the Sahara Desert kind of transitions into something else, you've had a number of attacks by what some people call jihadist forces and that sort of thing. And you have a large number of people who, in the countries I'm talking about, Mali, Burkina Faso, and so forth, and you have a large number of people who've been killed and displaced, and there's some NGOs, there are some non-government organizations who come into the area supposedly to help with food and housing and that kind of thing. Because of the Ukrainian situation, these NGOs are cutting their budgets by on average, about 70% to move their resources into Ukraine. Now, the world is upset, and the world should be upset about what's happening in Ukraine. And we talk about nearly 2 million, about 2 million now, refugees and so forth. But we're talking about 40 million refugees coming out of the wars that have been fought by United States and its NATO allies and others in places like Libya and Syria and Iraq, Afghanistan, and we don't seem to have the same compassion for those. And so even as you have right now, you have people who are fleeing those wars, many of which are paid for by US tax dollars, now have to step aside and see Ukrainian refugees now enter where they cannot enter. So this is part of a growing issue where we begin to see white supremacy and certain types of white nationalism, stated as white nationalism, not stated as just one country nationalism versus another country, but now using whiteness in the same way as whiteness was used in this country.
Right.
So we're seeing an internationalization of those forces. They're connecting with each other around the world. So this is kind of sort of where we are right now, and it's going to be some difficult days ahead for Africa. Now, the other thing that's going to happen is the sanctions, which are pretty tough, very tough, are going to have an impact worldwide, not just in the United States. You've been, unless you have a electric powered car, you know what the price of gas is, and it hasn't finished going up.
Absolutely.
And as the price of gas goes up, the price of food goes up, and everything else goes up. So, we have the possibility of entering a worldwide recession that could deepen into a worldwide depression. You know, these are a serious worldwide situation. United States does not itself depend that much on Russian oil, but the rest of the world does. I mean, Russia is one of the largest producers, if not the largest producer in the world, oil, and so a shortage of oil from Russia knock kicks up the prices, and it's a major player in OPEC. So right now, OPEC countries are benefiting in many ways from these high prices. So it's and not just the price of oil, but also the price of gas. And right now, you know, for those of us who heat our homes with gas, and especially places like Europe, Germany, right in the middle of the cold season, where it's getting the bulk of its heating gas from Russia. This is a tremendous problem. These prices are going way to sky high, and as everything else goes sky high, so does the potential for serious hyperinflation, the type of inflation that's very difficult to bring down. And it's the hyperinflation that led to World War II. People talk about World War II, and they talk about the Hitler going into Czechoslovakia and what they call the appeasement of Hitler. But that's not, to me, I don't think that's the relevant example. The relevant example is what happened between World War I and World War II, when the Allies, the victorious Allies, placed really very extremely harsh, draconian reparations on Germany, the type that it was difficult to pay back, which led to hyperinflation in Germany. And the destabilization from that hyperinflation is what brought fascists to power. So we're gonna see if people don't become a little more saner and begin to talk about pulling back from all of this big time war talk, and begin to talk about serious negotiations on the basis of understanding that, in fact, Russia does have legitimate concerns that have to be addressed. If that doesn't occur, and if that doesn't happen, everybody keeps pumping up and the war talk, then we're headed into the kind of economic situation that can create destabilization around the world. And that's part of the problem. Now back to Africa again. Ukraine and one of the former leaders of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev, was Ukrainian, right? And he was an agriculturalist. That's how he got to run the country. He was pretty successful in agriculture. And one of the things that they were able to do under his leadership was to really up the wheat production. So right now, Ukraine and Russia are two of the biggest wheat producers in the world. So, and it's a major supply of wheat to Africa, especially North Africa. So if that price of wheat goes up very high, or cannot hit the market, and you're talking about in North Africa and in the rest of the Arab world, where bread is so important, and bread is subsidized by the state, by the government. Egypt subsidizes the cost of this wheat so people can eat that basic staple thing. Then that can cause some destabilization. We don't know which direction it'll go, left, right, middle, or whatever. But these are all questions that have, we don't know what the answers can be, but we know that to continue in this headlong rush to war creates problems. We do know this, that in the about midway through Donald Trump's administration, the military released a very important study, and I'm sure Putin has seen it, where it said that study said it's time for the United States to end the war on terror and begin to prepare itself for war with Russia and China. And so when we look at the Russian situation, it's not just about Russia, it's also about China. And so where this goes, how it plays out, is anybody's guess, but it can play out to be significant danger to the world's people. Yeah.
And I think you've done a great job of explaining, especially to our people, like why they should even be concerned about something going on, in Ukraine and Russia, beyond, just caring about human beings, but just, how it impacts us here and abroad. I think you've done a great job on clearing that up. Although I think people that have been going to the gas stations understand how they're being impacted right now. But let me ask you a last question, and we can end on this one. What, if anything, can we do? Let me give you an example. Just like back when we had apartheid in South Africa, and it was like, we tried to boycott Coca-Cola and, different, companies that we felt actually supported apartheid. Is there anything that we can do as a community? And I'm not talking about the government, I'm talking about us as a community, to improve this situation now, and its impact on our people?
Well, one thing we have to do is let people know that that this rush to war is not a good thing. I mean, that is something that we have to contact the government about, saying, hey, we disagree with this heavy push to war, because everybody's on the war bandwagon now. And and we need to talk about something that could have been dealt with earlier in terms of real negotiation around real issues. But in terms of our community, we need to think in terms of different models of consumption and doing things. So we need to think of terms of how do we pool our dollars collectively in terms of buying and selling and doing business. So that's what we call cooperative or cooperative buying, where you buy collectively and whatnot. That's going to help you survive just a little bit. No, it's not going to help everything, just help in survival. But for me, in terms of the long-term piece, what we have to really, and I talk about this stuff, and I think sometimes people say, "Oh, this guy, he's beating his horse all the time." But this question of Pan-Africanism for us is extremely important, because we see if the world goes in one direction or if it goes in another direction, we're kind of at the will of where the world goes. We have to begin to create a power base in the world, in the same way you have whites all around the world trying to do, some whites, Western whites trying to come in and do something for Ukraine. We have to have a power base in the world that can kind of deal with the interests of Black folks around the world and in Africa itself, because people and our folks in Africa are catching hell right now. And so that's critical, because some of the stuff that as we move into this post oil economy, because we've been in an oil economy for the last maybe 100 years, maybe or so, about 100 years, a little over 100 years. And we're moving out of that into something else. One of the things Ukraine does have is lithium that you need for batteries for those electric cars. That hasn't been talked about a lot, but it has it. Russia has some of the other minerals, or what you call rare earths, that are necessary for the new economy. China has them, and Africa has them. So, if we can build a capacity in a collective way to process these resources ourselves, and build the next, and electric cars are going to be taken, I think, bypassed in some years, some decades down the road by hydrogen fuel cells. In fact, Toyota just built a hydrogen fuel cell car that they're going to sell only in California. But I think that's really going to be the wave. That's where Toyota's betting its money. But I think we need as a people to be in front of all of this stuff, and not just merely supplying the resources and supplying the hard work. And when I say that, I'm talking about here and in Africa itself. We need to be in a position to be in the lead, in the forefront. That is to see what's coming down the track 40, 50, 60 years before it happens, so we can be there to take advantage of what happens. Otherwise, if we don't have, and the thing we have to understand is power is international. If we don't have international power, power at an international level, then we get lost. It's good to have power at the city council and that sort of thing, and in your city and your town. It's good to have power in your state, whatever state you live in, or at the national level. But the real power in the world is international, and you have to, in order to do that, you have to enter that as a nation state. And the problem with Africa is in terms of doing that, is there are 54 or so nation states operating separately, and none of them have the capacity as an individual state to do anything. But all of them collectively as one mega country could really change the whole dynamic in the whole world. So if we can get, why should there be? It's nothing wrong. I mean, it's a great thing to have student exchanges all over the world, but we should have some of the greatest medical schools. We do have some good medical schools, but we should have, we're sending our students. When I say our, we're talking in Africa now, all around the world, when we need to build top universities all over Africa. We have some very good ones, but we need them all over Africa. And we need the type of universities in Africa where students from the United States, students from Brazil, students from Jamaica or Haiti and so forth would jump at the chance to go to those schools. Those are some of the things we have to build. And we have to be intentional about it. We have to be hard-nosed about it and determined to get it done. Because unless, Kwame Nkrumah was the leading Pan-Africanist of the 20th century. And his ideas still are the highest ideas in terms of what we're talking about. He was educated at an HBCU in Pennsylvania, Lincoln University, and he learned about the Garvey movement when he would go into Philadelphia. He learned what it was like to be a worker working on a shipping yard in Chester, PA. He knew what it was like because he lived in Harlem. Sometimes he slept out there on the street. It was in the middle of the Depression. So he understood this country in many ways from the bottom up. And when he took his country over, he said, the independence of our country means nothing without the independence of the West of Africa. And in his organization, his political party, not only did he talk about Africa, but he talked about Africans in the diaspora, the children of slavery. And when he made his push, when he talked to the British, when he spoke before the British about granting Ghana its independence, he started off with the horrors of the slave trade. And so it was in the very DNA of his country's constitution. It was written in the Constitution right there. We were written right there. And we came there and we assisted in helping the building of that country. Shirley Graham Du Bois was there, her husband, W.B. Du Bois. Shirley Graham was in many ways more effective, because she was a lot younger than the husband, and very effective, very active in many things. But Nkrumah was overthrown by the United States.
Mm-hmm.
It's public record that the CIA was the instrumental force in overthrowing him. You go down a little ways and you go to the Congo, where you have a young man by the name of Patrice Lumumba, who in 1959, just before independence, or 58 maybe, wrote a poem to Black folks in the United States. not just in the United States, but primarily to us in the United States and those of us who have been enslaved in the West. And he was talking about what slavery did, how it just, how the things that it did to us. And he was saying, don't worry, we're coming. We're going to build this thing.
Mm-hmm.
He came to recruit he came to Howard University to recruit students. I mean, the government came to Howard University to recruit students to come to Congo to work. CIA and the Belgians were involved in killing him.
Mm-hmm.
Not just killing him, but throwing him in a vat of acid so nobody could find his remains. So Malcolm X, in his last message, his last speech he gave in Detroit prior to his assassination, said, you don't know what's going on in Mississippi unless you know what's going on in Congo. He said, this thing that we're trying to do is the most important thing, and this is what we have to do. And within a few weeks, he was dead.
Right.
So this thing we have to do is, it's important because they kill us when we try to do it.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So it's, if anytime, and that's a measure of how good this thing is. You know what I'm saying? Because the leading people who do it, they get the bullet or whatever.
Right.
So this is why we have to continue doing it. And some of them, they can't kill us all.
Right.
They might try. We have some out here who would definitely try.
Right.
But this is the thing. And if we don't do this thing, we will die, because as John Henry Clark used to say, it's Pan-Africanism or perish.
Right.
So a lot of times people hear this stuff and get to this Africa talk and they say, oh Lord, here we go again.
Right.
Here we go again. Yeah, and I understand because it sounds sounds a little far-fetched, and why should we be concerned with something so far away? And and I have enough problems right here. In my neighborhood, right in my community. People are dying right in my community. We don't have the things we need right in our community, and that's true. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying because Nkrumah said, he said, for Black folks in the United States, the first thing you have to do, he said, for Pan-Africanists in the United States, if you're a Black person in the United States, you're a Pan-Africanist, the first thing you have to do is take care of the needs of your people in your community. That's the first thing.
Right.
Then you have to educate them and politically about, all sorts of things. But then after you do that, you have to also connect what you're doing to what's happening around the world. And it's particularly what's going on the continent, the motherland, because we would not have survived slavery. And I'll finish with this. We would not have survived slavery if we had not had the cultural, the intellectual, the spiritual, the technical values that allowed us to survive in this hostile land, allowed us in many ways to thrive, to build. We brought with us the basis for building family, which meant that even when you sold people down the river, right? And that's, and that idea of you getting sold down the river comes out the slave trade thing.
Right.
Even when they sell us down the river and break up families, we still had what the European sociologists call an extended family, right? The extended family was what made us. We had spirituality that we brought with us. We had teachings that we taught our young, so that with the so-called Brer Rabbit and different things like that, to show that you don't have to be the biggest and strongest or richest animal in the forest to win. You might not have any of the muscle, but you have to use that wit and to outthink and outmaneuver people who would do you in. So it was the intellectual, the spiritual, the cultural. We came on the plantation and we said, well, what dance do you do? And we developed collective dances on these plantations. This thing they call jazz, they say a lot of people miscall it American music. That had nothing to do with it. Jazz down there in Louisiana was formed in the place they call Congo Square.
Right.
And they used to have different African, you know, if you were from one place you'd play for a time, then the other place you'd play for a time. And then the slave master say, "Dag, these people taking all our money. They are playing this music." So they made them all play in the same place at the same time. Jazz was a result of all these different Africans from all these different places playing in the same place at the same time. All it is it's a pan-African music.
Right.
And it's the father of all this other stuff, the blues and all this other jazz, all this other stuff. So we we have a lot. We wouldn't have survived without what Mother Africa gave us when we came here, prepared us. And most of us were youngsters. In the early days of the slave trade, most of us were young men, teenagers, just like we are today going into prisons.
Right.
And so we came here with something that allowed us to survive even when our elders were not here with us.
Well, once again, Dr. Holmes, I want to, thank you for blessing us with this jewels and blessing the audience with these jewels. And I think you've done a great job of connecting the dots and just answering the question as to why our people should care about what's going on in Ukraine and Russia and with this situation and how it impacts our people. So again, I want to thank you. I want to thank everybody for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time.
Lord, yes, papi, hit me one time and make it funky.
I was brought up and told to have no fear.